your life.
So I hope everybody had a great Pesach. 8 days of joy. But in the middle of it, we begin to count the Omer. And the Omer is the period of time between Pesach, the second day of Pesach, really the first day of HaOmer Pesach in Israel and Deraisa. And for us, it's the second day of Pesach, until Shavuos. And that's exactly 7 weeks. So we want to talk a little bit about that and some of the things that it tells us about the time in which it was given and how we understand it. I also want to speak about the Parsha of this week, Shmini, which is obviously connected to this discussion as well. So the first thing to know about the Parsha is about the command to bring the Omer is a very interesting phrase. It says, "You shall." This comes from Vayikra, Leviticus 23. So it says, "Usavtem." Usavtem lechem milcheras hashabbos miyom. You shall count for yourselves from the morrow day of rest, from the Shabbos, from the day when you bring the Omer of the waving of 7 weeks. They shall be complete. So it's a very interesting phrase. It implies that you should count from Shabbos. So 7 weeks after Shabbos would be Sunday. So Shavuos should come every year on a Sunday. And this was the understanding of those people who didn't understand the oral Torah and hadn't learned the oral Torah, right? As Rabbi Skobek likes to point out, they were called the Sadducees, or the Tzeduki. And an easy way to remember that is that since they didn't learn the oral Torah, they were sad, you see.
Oh, yeah. I like that.
So, and they understood the Shabbos to be the Shabbos following Pesach, whenever it came, the first Shabbos after Pesach. Right? And you would count 7 weeks, 49 days, and then you would have Shavuos. Right? But the Perushim, right, the rabbis, had a tradition handed down from Moshe Rabbeinu that this 7-day count began the day after Pesach, and Pesach was the Shabbos. Why would Pesach be a Shabbos? This is something that Rabbi Samson Rapheal Hirsch talks about. He points out that you could not have the new grain until after Pesach. That there was a Shabbos restriction of Pesach not to harvest the grain. So Pesach was like a Shabbos. It was a kind of Shabbos in itself. And there are many other reasons why it's called a Shabbos, but this is the one that he says that the scythe of the farmer...
That's why it says the Shabbos in the...
That's what, right. That the scythe of the farmer should rest on this day of Pesach, right? So even if you wanted to eat the new grain from the new crop, you couldn't cut it, right? And the law prohibits you from eating grain cut before Pesach. So in principle, if it wasn't a Shabbos, you could cut the grain on Pesach and eat it. But because it's a Shabbos, you can't. We treat it as a Shabbos, you can't cut the grain, right? So the rabbis, the sages, explain to us that we begin to count the day after Pesach. Right? In the diaspora, in Golos, we count on the second day of Pesach. Right? And then we count exactly 49 days. So this was a time, we mentioned before, of great joy. It was the harvest time, the time when the wheat was being brought in, and the barley, all the different grains it was a great and joyous time until the tragedies that befell Rabbi Akiva and eventually the disasters that we suffered as a nation. It happened during the Crusades as well. During the Omer time was a very bad time. There were many disasters, slaughters, massacres that happened during that time. And of course the tragedy of the destruction of the of the last Jewish state under Bar Kokhba happened at that time as well. But mostly we remember the death of the 12,000 pairs of students of Rabbi Akiva.
Wow.
And it was pointed out recently to me that we mourn so greatly for this for many reasons. One that we've talked about before was that these would have been the shluchim of Mashiach. Had Bar Kokhba fulfilled his mandate and his potential, he would have been Mashiach, and these 24, and Rabbi Akiva would have been the spiritual leader of the nation, and they would have spread out. These 24,000 or 12,000 pairs would have spread out throughout the world to bring the light of Torah to the world. That's one. But even in a smaller dream, the tragedy is tremendously great. If you remember that after this tragedy, Rabbi Akiva was a tremendous loss, 24,000 students. Right? The pain it must have caused the Rebbe, it's unimaginable. But he pulled himself together. He knew that Torah had to continue in spite of this tragedy, in spite of the Romans. That, it's a very famous story told by Rabbi Akiva that about the fox and the fish. That the fish are swimming up the stream and they can see the net of the fishermen. And they're terrified because if they swim too fast, they won't be able to elude the net. It's right across the stream, they're finished. Right? So the fox comes to them and he says, I have a solution, right? Come live with me. We'll make a nest in a tree or whatever, we'll climb somewhere, just follow me, right? And I'll take you away from the net of the fishermen, you'll be fine. The fish look at the fox and say, you're supposed to be the cleverest of animals. You're a fool. It may be that the fisherman will catch some of us in his net, and that's a tragedy, we'll be lost. But if we follow you, we'll all be lost. We'll all die. How stupid are we? And how stupid are you to suggest it? So Rabbi Akiva explains that the water is the Torah, and the fish are the Jews, and the net and the fishermen may be the Romans. And there's tremendous suffering that they're causing us. But if we decide to leave the water of Torah, then we will no longer exist. So he understood this, and even through this tragedy of the loss of 24,000 students, he began again with 5 students, right? And really, those 5 students give us all the oral Torah.
Wow.
All comes from those 5 students. One of them, maybe one of the most famous is Shimon Bar Yochai, who gives us also the Zohar.
He's a student of Rabbi Akiva.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
He's one of the 5.
Wow.
And you can imagine what the Gemara is like today, the Mishnah is like today, right? From 5 of his students. Imagine the gems, the wealth that was lost when we lost 24,000, 12,000 pairs. So this is part of the tragedy of the Omer, and there's many tragedies of the Omer. But the Omer is a very strange time because it combines this terrible period of tragedy with this glorious expectation. Because on Pesach, we become physically free. And we become physically free really through no merit of our own. It's a gift from God, right? We were idol worshippers in Egypt. We had sunk to the 49th level of tuma, of impurity. Had we gone to the 50th level, we never would have left. That God himself had to come and take us out. That Amalek couldn't do it. The whole story is not a story of the great merit of the Jewish people, quite frankly. But in the period of time that we're in now, these 49 days, 7 weeks of 7 days, was a period of time in which the Jews worked on themselves day by day, changing themselves, preparing themselves for the great day of Matan Torah, the day that would be unique in all of history. And I say unique sparingly, it's not a word I use very often, but it's the day when God directly communicated with mankind, and not with an individual in a dream, or somebody in a trance, or somebody told me that they heard from God. Right? He actually spoke in words that hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people heard at that moment. Right? So, and never again. This was the moment of revelation. It's recognized by the three great religions. And we're very aware of it, and we've learned much about it, and we'll learn more about it as the days go on. But we're preparing ourselves now for Matan Torah, for the gift of Torah that comes on Shavuos. And these days are days of repairing character flaws. Right? And the weeks are broken up. But my point that I wanted to come back to was that the idea that was misunderstood by the Tzedukim, and the rabbis understood it correctly, right? And this is the case in many situations, right? Because they would have started this too late. They would have ended it after Shavuos. Instead, we do it properly as the rabbis have prescribed, and we have a better understanding what the Shabbos says. So, Rav Hirsch writes a great deal about the Omer, and I want to make a couple of points to give the Omer a little bit more depth and color, because it's important. Clearly, the great Jewish holidays of Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot are agricultural holidays as well, and spiritual holidays, and historical holidays. All of them. Neither one is contrary to any of the other qualities of the holiday. So during the cutting, the harvesting of the grains and stuff like that, it's a great joyous time. And it's also a time of building that we're doing individually ourselves. But it's kind of curious that it really should have no meaning for us now. I shouldn't say now because we have the state of Israel back, but for 2,000 years, when we had lost the state of Israel and we were living entirely in Galus, what was the significance of the harvest, in
Israel,
in Belarus? What was the significance of the harvest in Winnipeg or in Oklahoma, right? I'm not sure, because it was specifically about the land of Israel. Right? And there's a big debate as to whether the Omer is a rabbinic event today or whether it's derisive. There's many points, we won't go into it, but whether it is a Torah commandment today without a base of English, right? Or whether, because we can't bring the Omer,
right?
Because the first thing you do is bring an Omer of barley, right? So, or parched kernels of barley to the base of English. We can't do it. And the end of it is to bring the loaves of bread, right? As if to say we've gone from barley, which is a rough food that is used to feed animals primarily, also people, we have it in soup, stuff like that, but it's a very nourishing food for animals, to the most refined of products, which is beautiful loaves of wheat bread that are brought challah. It's one of the few times when leavened products are brought into the base of English, right? It's not burned, but it's brought there. That this whole idea doesn't seem to make sense with no temple. How do you bring sacrifices? So Rav Hirsch makes a very interesting point, because he was living at the very end of the diaspora, 100 years in this 2,000-year cycle before we had a state of Israel. And he says that the festival in the final years really became a harvest festival. And we didn't understand the significance of putting the scythe aside, waiting for the Shabbos of Pesach, right? And then that what we were doing was, when we started to cut the wheat, we were recognizing by this pause, right, where we would look at fields of grain, the beautiful harvest time, and not do anything. It's very strange, right? Why? It's the same concept we see with Shemitah and with Yovel, right? Is that in order to own the products of the land of Israel, all products, but especially the land of Israel, we have to acknowledge the original owner is God, and that God gives them to us. It's one of the basic principles of making a bracha. I take an apple, this apple comes from a tree, the apple, everything in it is God's. I make the bracha ha'etz, right? The fruit of the tree, right? And at that point, the ownership of the apple transfers from God to me. When I don't make the bracha, and I know that I should, right? Then I'm stealing. Right? So these ideas of the bracha of Yovel, the Jubilee year, of the Shemitah year that comes every 7 years, and pausing before the harvest, right, is intended to tell us this land belongs to God, and He's giving it to us to use, right, to be the stewards of, so to speak. But we don't have this land. Right? Come back to the point.
Where are we supposed to do? Yeah.
So, the stewards of what land? We couldn't own anything. We were living in Russia beyond the pale. We had, they could kick us off the land in the blink of an eye, right? And they did over and over and over. How many stories do we have? We came to a country, we got kicked out. We came to a country, we got kicked out. Over and over and over, right? So, what is all this about? It's hard to understand. Rav Hirsch says that we began to fail in our ability to celebrate the holiday. That we celebrated the holiday as a pure agricultural event towards the end. We didn't understand that the pause was a pause of recognition of God's ownership of the land, and that the Omer was a time not between parties from one party to the next, but rather that it was a time of seriously examining yourself, working on yourself, and improving yourself in preparation for a far greater gift than the grain. Because the truth of the matter is that everything that we have comes through Torah, from God through Torah. It says God looked into the Torah and created the universe. It's a very kind of curious statement. Like, He needed a manual. Right? We have an understanding that Torah existed in some form long, long before Matan Torah, right? And that the angels argued that it should never leave heaven. We know all sorts. We'll talk about it a little more when we come to this point again. But we have to understand that the gift of the harvest may only be a metaphor for the greater gift, which is the gift of Torah that comes at the end. During our 2,000 years that Rav Hirsch is writing about at the end of it, he makes a very interesting point and then tells a cautionary tale. It's actually quite scary when you read it. He says that we performed the mitzvah of Sefira for 2,000 years.
What's Sefira?
Counting the Omer.
Okay.
Counting the as you know, the Omer is divided into 7 sections weekly, and each one represents a Kabbalistic Sefira. Whether it's Chesed or Gevurah, judgment.
That pattern.
Exactly. Yeah. So those are the different Sefirot because we're counting.
That word. Yeah.
But he says that we did this successfully through massacres, through humiliation, through murder, through torture and beatings, through enslavement, through everything. And during the whole time, we maintained a dignity. We maintained an optimism that someday we would have the temple back. It seemed at times that there was no basis for such optimism. But still we counted the Omer, and still at the end of counting the Omer we said that we want the temple back. Right? There's a prayer at the end of the Omer that specifically says that it should be rebuilt today. And so he concludes And it's a very important point that we have successfully, during these years, passed the test of counting the Omer, even though we had no land, even though we had no temple, and making clear that the reason we were doing it is because we desperately want to bring the sacrifice. We do want to bring the korban, the Omer, at the second day of Pesach. We do want to bring the korban of Shavuos, of the lechem, at Matan Torah. We do want Torah. We do want a Beis HaMikdash. We need it, we want it, we miss it, we crave it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Omer is a time that centers and focuses on our preparation for it and our needs for it. And Rav Hirsch says God should realize that we passed this test. We passed it. We're done. Right? Now give us the land, give us the temple. And then he cautions what we did through pain and blood and humiliation and suffering. We would be able to do it through prosperity, through security, through comfort. Maybe that's a greater test.
Yeah.
And when you read his writings about this, they almost seem prophetic. Now,
We're very comfortable now, right?
I like to think that we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Baruch Hashem, we have control of the physical land of Israel. The rest of the world wants to take that control away from us, by the way, and lest anyone think that we're secure, we should look, what the United Nations views as Israel. We should see that Israel is considered the greatest threat to peace in the world, not Iran, not North Korea, not rogue Hezbollah, but the only democratic state in the Middle East, the only stable country in the Middle East, the only country whose springtime in the midst of the Arab Spring was about civil protests concerned with the welfare of people, right? And those people who are protesting will have an opportunity, if they choose, to change the government through the ballot box, right? This is the country that has become a pariah to the world. So maybe Rav Hirsch is telling us we're not so secure. So we're not yet at that level of test. And we certainly don't have the temple. But we seem to have it better than we've had it for a very long time. Financially, the economy of Israel, thank God, is doing well. Baruch Hashem. The government seems to have a stability through its electoral process. There's a lot to feel comfortable about. But in the midst of it, we should know that the test that we passed through 2,000 years of exile and pain, right, is now in its second stage. Right? We're part of the test in North America because we have it easy here. Baruch Hashem. People living in Israel are certainly part of that test. And we have a long way to go before we can say to God, we've done as well in the comfort of a golden gullus. We've done as well in the comfort of finally having our own land back with Sefira, with counting the Omer, as we did through the worst and the darkest times. We should pray that God doesn't say to us, you did only well during dark times, I'll help you do well again. That He gives us the opportunity to mature. That He gives us the opportunity to appreciate the gift of Matan Torah that's coming, the counting and the preparation that's part of it, the pause at Pesach that tells us it's a Shabbos. The fields are ready to be harvested, and we're not going to do it. We couldn't do it before Pesach because it's forbidden. We can't do it on Pesach because it's a Shabbos. After Pesach we can do it, and we're ready to wait, right? Because we understand it's a gift from the Rabbon Shalom. We understand that it's only ours after we fulfill our part of the covenant, our part of the bargain. So I want to give a bracha to everybody that, having finished Pesach, looking forward to the Shavuos, not just to the cheesecake of Shavuos and the ice cream, but to the learning and to the gift of Matan Torah, that this period of Sefira, through which we recognize the suffering that our people felt, concludes with the greatest joy and the greatest gift that anybody could have, and that we should root ourselves in this Torah, and that Hashem should bless us, and before Shavuos, instantly, God willing, should grant us the end of Galus in every sense of the word, and the rebuilding of the temple. B'mheira b'yameinu.
Amen.